Hi. I wanted today to start to introduce you to Buddhism. Uh, but I want to begin by thinking about that word. Buddhism is a word that definitely means something, but it doesn't mean a simple and precise thing the way something like right angle triangle names something very precise and exact. A right angle triangle is a closed three sided figure with a right angle in it. That's exact. And you can even say more things. You can say, if you take the length of this side and square it and add it to the length of this side squared, that will equal the length of this side squared. You can give very precise rules about it. You can't do that same thing with Buddhism. On the one hand, Buddhism is a way of life. When you can read something that says, there are, I don't know what the number is now, but 500 million Buddhists in Asia right now, something like that. But one thing you can notice about that is if you looked at those individual people, they don't all believe exactly the same thing. You can't say, oh, a Buddhist believes X, because you could ask, those different people and they would have different beliefs. But there are other meanings of the word too, right? You could also say by Buddhism, I mean what that historical guy, the Buddha, taught. Right? And so that's going to name this guy, if he existed, Siddhartha Gautama, who lived 2,500 years ago in northeast of India. And, that is a person who did have actual views if he existed. And, those views would be the ones that you could then say were the Buddha's views. That's what I'm going to be concerned about. But notice two things. Those views of the Buddha need not automatically be the same as the views of any given person who is legitimately and correctly called a Buddhist in that first sense. And indeed, it may even be the case that his views aren't really the same as the views that have shaped that thing we call Buddhist culture. Like, they may be, let's hope they are. But, a person could go back and try to study what the Buddha really meant and thought and use that as a way to criticize what gets, carried on under the name of Buddhism. So you can have that. But there are a couple other meanings too, right? Buddhism could also name the tradition of Buddhists, not just the sort of cultural way of life, but the people who actually themselves wanted to understand what the Buddha taught and studied it and studied the tradition of other people who studied it, right? And so there's this whole tradition of learning that would also be called Buddhism, which is the views of all those kinds of official carriers on of the tradition who studied it and interpreted it and so on. Those views, again, might or might not be the same as the Buddha's, and they might or might not be the same as the views that have shaped that culture, etc., etc. And there could be another one too, which would be you might think of Buddhism as a detachable set of doctrines. You might say this is what Buddhism amounts to. You may have got that from any one of those different sources, but you could pull those doctrines out. And if Buddhism were those doctrines, then you might find other people believe those same doctrines, even though they never studied the Buddha, they don't belong to that tradition, and they don't live in that culture. So my point is just then that you could use that word Buddhism to name quite different things. They're related to each other, of course. But when you use it to name one of those things, the things that apply to it aren't automatically the same as what apply to it in that other context. So I'm not trying to say there's anything meaningless about the word or any kind of problem to it. I'm saying you got to be careful how you use it. So why do I bring that out here? Well, for the reason that I said already, like, I want to actually study the guy, the Buddha. I want to study the views of Siddhartha Gautama, so far as we're able to find out what those are. And that's what I want to encourage you to be doing too. And so we're going to read some treatises to try to get at those things. But I want you to be careful when you're reading that you be attentive to these kinds of concerns I've just raised, because I want you to think about the things that are said in the book so far as you can make them out, and think for yourself about what those mean. And that's not the same as flipping on Wikipedia and seeing that, somebody says Buddhism is about this, right? We're not going to assume that all those other things that have been said in the name of Buddhism are authoritative. I mean, they might be right, they might be wrong, but that's not what I'm going to be concerned about. What I want to try to do is understand what I think this extremely profound and insightful guy from 2,500 years ago did and was trying to say. And I want you to try to stay focused on that as a distinct and demanding study based exclusively on reading these texts and thinking for yourself about them. There's also an extra complication here, and that is that it's not straightforward to know what the Buddha said. Ancient India, where Siddhartha Gautama lived, supposedly, didn't have particularly a tradition of historical writing. And so you can't go find the books where someone says, oh, here's this guy and he's doing these things, or anything like that. You also can't find treatises written by that guy. There's actually no clear mention of Buddhism until the time of the Emperor Ashoka, from somewhere around 250 BC, which is, a couple of hundred years after the Buddha would have lived. So there's no direct history in that sense. On the other hand, we have a lot of tales that were handed down, but they weren't committed to writing initially either. They weren't put into writing until quite a bit later. But those things that were eventually put into writing that we do possess were oral traditions. They were, stories that were passed down by the people who were trying to follow the Buddha, saying, here's what happened, here's what we're supposed to do, here's what he said. That is history, but it's not history like a history textbook gives you. It is real people trying to carry on a tradition, but without the kinds of consistency and ability to check on things that you would really want from rigorous historical writing. So that's what we're reading when we're going to read some discourses of the Buddha. We're going to read these things that were eventually written down, that were tales that were handed down by followers for centuries, that say, one time the Buddha came into this place and this is what he said. So I mention that just to emphasize that this is not like reading, a book by some author in some straightforward sense. And I think we can get an awful lot out of it. I think it's well worth your time to study these things. They're amazing. But you yourself need to learn a little bit about how to derive meaning from these kinds of texts. But anyway, so let me tell you a little bit about who the Buddha supposedly was. Siddhartha Gautama was born in the 200-year period from about 560 BC to about 360 BC. Somewhere in there, this guy lived for about 80 years. And he was born the son of a relatively rich and powerful chieftain. At that time, that part of India, the northern part of India, was dominated by Vedic culture. 1,000 years before that, 1500 BC, these people had come into India through the northwest. These people called Aryans, and they brought with them the Indo-European language and so on. They came in and sort of took over and brought with them a religion and a religious culture that was built around these texts. They had the Vedas, these sacred stories. And this Vedic culture had a pretty significant sort of class structure, a dividing up of types of people. So there was a priestly class, the Brahmins, who were very highly regarded and who were the ones who were responsible for carrying out their religious things. Then there was the military class, who were essentially leaders, the Kshatriya. There was a class of productive people, the farmers and the cow herders and later merchants. And then there was the lowest class of people who were the servants. And broadly, those were classes that were determined by birth. They were associated with different colors, as if they not skin color, but as if your soul was this color of soul or this type of soul, something like that. And that was a pretty fixed social order, and it was also built around a social system of households, and so people grew up, you know, in their household life defined by their place in this system of these basic sort of classes. But people also developed who didn't like that. And there was a particular group of people called the Renouncers who didn't look to that social system and the fixed order that determined the value of things. They didn't look to that for their salvation or the worth of their life, but they left, and they went as sort of reclusive people, wandering in the woods or whatever, seeking enlightenment on their own. I mention that just because it's helpful to know the kind of context in which Siddhartha Gautama was growing up. He's called the Buddha. Buddha is not a name but a title. It means the awakened one. But at this point, he was not the Buddha. At this point, he's just a guy. But so he grew up, according to the stories, with his wealthy dad. He grew up in a life of luxury, and he had a wife and a son. But supposedly, when he was in his late 20s, he discovered, things that he'd never had to encounter before. He saw, the story is, he went out and he saw an old guy, he saw a sick guy, and he saw a dead guy. But so he came into contact with aging, sickness, and death, where normally, he was young and healthy and vibrant. He was kept in a world where those things didn't show themselves. So he was confronted with those realities. And he also saw one of these renouncer guys, one of these guys with a shaved head, wearing a yellow robe, begging for food. And so, part of his story is he encountered those things, and that led him to make a decision. He said he went forth from home into homelessness. He left behind dusty household life, said goodbye to all that stuff, and went off. He went and studied with some people, apparently did very well at it, but thought that they weren't enough. And so then he really thought he was going to do this renouncer thing. And so he went out into the woods, and he tried to give up all pleasures of every kind. He stopped eating. He tried not to breathe very much. He sat down until he was, on the verge of death by, starving himself and so on, imagining that by sort of freeing himself from worldly bonds, he might reach kind of liberation. And he did that in the company of some other guys who were doing that. And at a certain point, when he was almost dead, he thought, isn't there some other way? Like, this doesn't seem quite right. And then he had a very important sort of revelation. He remembered a time, it's a story that's told, when he was a little boy sitting under a tree, watching a man plow a field. As the man plowed the field, plants got ripped up and so on, and a worm got pulled up and cut, and a bird came down and ate that worm and so on. And he took that whole thing in a kind of absorbed, disinterested way, and he remembered that moment now as a point when he felt like he, somehow had grasped the truth. And so he came out of his stance of renunciation, started eating again, and then went and talked to those monks and said, I attained it. I woke up. I attained my enlightenment, and I'm going to teach you. And then they followed him, and the rest is history, right? That's then the story of Buddhism. So we're going to be looking at this book, Early Buddhist Discourses, and we're going to start today with the first discourse, the Discourse on the Noble Quest. This begins by making it clear, as I said, that these are part of an oral tradition. It begins, "Thus I have heard." Right? So these are stories that have been handed down about what the Buddha did and what the Buddha said. And section 1, which goes on for a page or so, is just kind of introducing the situation, and the Buddha is with his friend Ananda, and Ananda wants him to come and talk to some young monks, some bhikkhus, because they want him to give them a lecture. Right, and so I want to just read one line from that. This is at the very end of section 1. This is on page 4. He says what these guys have been, asked these guys what they've been doing. They've been talking. He said, "Good bhikkhus, it is fitting, bhikkhus, that you, who are young men from good families, who have gone forth from home to homelessness out of faith, are seated together talking about the Dhamma." The Dhamma means basically, the truth. If you're a university student now, what I want is for you to see that you should be able to recognize yourself in that. Right? These are people, he's talking to people who have basically left their family life behind when they were children of some parents living at home, right? They've gone off on their own, and they've gone now to study with this guy. Right? So if you're in university, it's important to notice that you've done a similar kind of thing. You've launched yourself out into the world on your own, and it's kind of up to you now to figure out how you're going to live, and what you're going to believe, what you're going to do, how the world works, all that kind of stuff. And presumably, you've gone to university because you think people there have something to teach you. Well, these people too have launched themselves on a quest. They've gone out on their own to try to figure out what the truth is and how they should live. And they're getting together and talking with each other about those things, and they're seeking guidance from this guy. So anyway, I want you to think about that parallel, because it's very important when you read these things that you recognize that these aren't just stories about some detached thing that happened somewhere, sometime. These are things that have to speak to your own experience. And the only way you're going to get things out of them is if you try to have these things be speaking to you. Right? So anyway, I just want you to notice that sort of parallel. Anyway, in part 2 then, the next few paragraphs, the Buddha talks about, the things you can seek. Right? So he says, "Bhikkhus, there are these 2 quests, the noble quest and the ignoble quest." And he's going to define them. What is the ignoble one? Well, it is when someone who is himself liable to birth seeks after what is also liable to birth. Well, that's us, obviously. We're people who live and die and so on. We come into being and pass away. Well, sometimes to find our fulfillment and satisfaction, we can look for it in other things that similarly come into being and pass away, living things, dying things, and so on. So notice there's a list, right? We're liable to birth, and we seek after things that are liable to birth. Liable to old age, seek after what is liable to old age. Liable to sickness, seeks after what is liable to sickness. Death, sorrow, impurity. And notice the sentences are structured exactly the same. You're going to see a lot of that, things that are a series of points are made, and each time all of the language is repeated. The translator has done a helpful job here of removing that sometimes and just put in ... But that's again part of the structure of these things as handed down oral text that people were trying to memorize and recite. But the important thing to see then is just this list of characteristics: liable to death, liable to old age, liable to sickness, death, sorrow, and impurity. That's us. But we can also seek for our fulfillment in things that are of the same sort. That's what he's calling the ignoble quest, the one that's not so good. And he says, he then asks, what are some of those things? Sons and wives, male and female servants, various, animals you might have, if you're a farmer or something, goats, sheep, pigs, and so on. Gold and silver. He's talking in 400 BC, the kinds of things people had around them weren't identical to the things that people have around them in, the 21st century. But the same kinds of things, right? You can try to solve the issues of your life by a relationship, or by, being in charge of people, being powerful and having servants and so on, being the boss. You can try to have stuff, you can try to have money. Trying to build a successful life on those things, he's saying that's ignoble. It's not going to work. And he goes on with a little bit further there. He says, these are things that one attaches to. These things one attaches to are liable to birth, etc., etc., and he lists all the other ones. And he describes the person who is attached to them. this person is enslaved, infatuated, and addicted to them. So we're going to come back and talk about that again pretty soon. But I want you just to notice that this description, right? We are liable to all these things, death and so on. We can try to make our lives worthwhile by attaching ourselves to other things like that. And that attachment turns out to be a kind of slavery and addiction. And that's the ignoble quest. And then he says, what is the noble quest? In number 3. And he says, well, in that case, someone who is liable to birth and all the others, having seen the danger in what is liable to birth and all the others, seeks the unborn, unsurpassed escape from bondage that is nibbana. Sometimes you'd see the Sanskrit version of that, which is nirvana, same thing. So the noble quest is not seeking your fulfillment in those things, but seeking your fulfillment in something that is not all of those things. Again, we'll go on and talk about that. The next few sections, 4, 5, 6, and 7, just tell his story of what happened when I tried to do this. And I already gave you a version of that story, so I'm not going to go through that in detail here. I'm just going to note a couple of things. But, he said he went out. He went to study with this guy, Alar Kalama, and he did really good at those studies. The guy said, you can learn this, and the Buddha did learn it. We discovered that wasn't enough. And I just want to draw your attention to one thing. He said, yeah, I learned it. He said, well, I spoke the doctrine that I was supposed to learn as far as mere lip service and repetition were concerned. So he learned how to say those things. He learned how to repeat those things. But then he said, then I had this thought, Alar Kalama does not merely proclaim this. He proclaims that he has understood and realized it for myself. And so then the Buddha says, I got to do that too. And he does. I just want to emphasize that. The point is made here and repeatedly that there's a real difference between having heard something and being able to reproduce it versus having really taken it in yourself and grasped it. So he is again here making the point that I was making, that in learning, the learning has to really speak to you. And you really have to learn it so that you inhabit it and you're on the inside of it. Right? Anyway, he says he did that. He did that with Alar Kalama's teaching. Alar says, well, that's great. You should come and teach with me. And the Buddha says, yeah, it's not enough. This didn't solve my... This didn't give me what I needed. And so then in number 5, he said he did the same thing. He went and studied with another fellow, Udaka Ramaputta. And the same thing happened. He really internalized the stuff and learned it, but that wasn't good enough for him. He didn't really give him the solution to his life that he wanted. So then he says, number 6, so on a quest for what is good, searching for the unsurpassed highest path to peace. So that's, note right there what this is about. He's not trying to get rich. He's trying to be good, right? And it went to this park that was near a village, and he said, well, this is a good place for me because I don't have to live right in the village, but there are people there, like I can just set up camp in the park, and if I need to have food or money or whatever, I can go there and I can beg, and there'll be people there who can give me stuff, but I'm going to take on my own private sort of spiritual quest in this park. And he says, well, that's where I attained nirvana. That's where I attained nirvana. So he doesn't go into the story here of the dramatic story of what happened. So I want to just remind you of that. I said a little bit about it before, but as I said, the moment is he was in the park and he was trying to do these things like starve himself and so on, because he thought maybe that would, release him to a higher vision and so on. And then he said, is there some other way to do this? And that's when he had this memory of his experience when he was a child. I just want to tell you a little bit more of that story, right? So he's 9 years old, and he's at a festival. People are chanting, all kinds of stuff is happening. And he gets tired or whatever, and he goes and sits under a tree. And while he's sitting there, he sees a man plowing the field, and it's the hot sun. The guy's working hard. The plow ox is working really hard to pull the plow. The ground is getting churned up. Worms are getting knocked out of their homes. Some are getting cut up. And then he sees these birds flying around in the sky, and he thinks, oh, I know why they're there. And sure enough, they go down and get their lunch. And he's seeing the interesting interconnection of all these things. And one of the things that characterizes all of those parts, the man plowing, the ox pulling, the worms getting pulled up and chopped up, the birds eating, is they all are grappling with satisfying their needs and desires, and grappling with discomfort and comfort, pain and pleasure, and so on. And they're doing it in this interesting, interconnected way. You can understand why the man is plowing. You can see how that's causing the problem for the worms. You can see why that's making the birds happy for the short term, because they're going to get their lunch, then they're going to be hungry again, and so on. But so the Siddhartha, who wasn't yet awakened, so you can't really call him the Buddha yet, but Siddhartha was there, and he had this moment of just sort of feeling like he identified with all those things. He was sort of spontaneously, compassionately sympathetic with all of them, and also accepting of it. And so he sat and just had a moment of just being totally absorbed in it. And his absorption didn't involve any desires on his part to do this or that. It was just a grasp of that whole thing in its interconnection, an understanding of, what was going on, and a sense of compassion, caring for all of those things. So that's the moment he recognized when he was in the forest trying to starve himself, and he suddenly thought, oh, you know what? That was my first enlightenment. And so he reflected back on that experience of himself and thought that was the time when he had actually adopted the stance that offered real insight and a real sort of a proper attitude towards himself. And so he wanted to build on that. So now he says, I attained it. When I recognized that about my own path, I realized I have the insight. I've awakened to what actually matters. And so we're going to go on and talk about that in a minute, but I want to say the next thing that happens here. Before he goes on and gets into what the essential learning is you're supposed to get from that, he says, what happened? He says in number 8, he said, well, I had this thought, that what I have accomplished is deep and difficult to see, and it's peaceful and excellent, etc., etc., etc. But then he says, for other people, this is actually, most people, it's hard to have this moment. And he said, so were I to teach this Dhamma, this truth, and others were not to understand me, that would be wearisome and vexing to me. And so he thought, maybe I'm just going to retreat into this insight I've had and be satisfied with this. And that turns out not to be good. And so then in number 9, he says, Brahma Sahampati read my mind and came and talked to him. And it's like saying, then God came and talked to me. Right? Basically, he has a kind of a experience inside himself of it's almost like conscience tapping him on the shoulder and saying, like, come on, buddy. So, Brahma Sahampati comes and speaks to him and says, yeah, you know what? You can't do that. You got to go out and share this. You got to go out and teach. So section 9 is him. Sections 8 and 9 are him having this wisdom and thinking, oh, this is just for me. Now I can be self-satisfied. But then having this, voice inside him saying, no, it's up to you to go out and share this with other people. And so in number 10, he says, so, having heard Brahma's request, out of compassion for beings, I surveyed the world with the eye of a Buddha, and I saw all these people and realized I should go bring the good news to them. So he's going to go teach. And so then he says, where am I going to start? And so he says, well, in number 12, I remember those other monks I met in the forest when I was trying to starve myself. I'm going to go talk to them. And on the way, he runs into this guy. This is section 13. He runs into this guy, Upaka. And Upaka says, hey, there's that guy. And he says, hey, you're looking pretty good. Who is your teacher? Whose doctrine do you profess? And Siddhartha says, Conquering all, knowing all am I. Undefiled among all things, renouncing all, I am freed by the destruction of craving. Having understood all this for myself, whom should I declare as my teacher? I have no teacher. There is no equal to me. So I want you to think about that. This really picks up on this idea I've mentioned twice already about the importance of sort of owning this and doing it on your own. And his point is, yeah, I went to those teachers, and what they gave me was fine, but I had to go and do something on my own, and this is a transformation that happened in me. That's important for a lot of reasons. It means, on the one hand, you don't have to look somewhere else for it. It's not some magic thing out in the world. There's no special secret doctrines, nothing like that. But on the other hand, it means you also have to do it. Right? And so anyway, this guy's a little put off, I guess, and he says, well, it sounds like you're saying you're an arahant, an infinite victor. And again, Siddhartha says, victors are those like me. Right? So the other guy says, okay, I recognize you as one of those types. I'm going to put you in that familiar group. And it seems like what the Buddha wants to say here is, no, like you can't interpret this by other things. You've got to do it on your own. And when you've done that, you realize, oh yeah, it's by virtue of doing this that anyone gets to be called, a victor or enlightened or whatever. Anyway, so that's what I want to emphasize out of that section. This guy walks away because he said, that guy's crazy. But anyway, so then in number 14, the Buddha goes back and finds those monks, and they say, oh, again, there's that guy, right? Hey. And they were sort of grumpy at him before because he'd been, supposed to be renouncing things, and then at a certain point he started eating things, and they thought he lost the path and he went the way of luxury. So anyway, he's coming in. First they say, let's shun that guy, but they actually like him. And so he says, but as I approached, the group of 5 monks was not able to keep the agreement to ignore him. And some of them came out to meet me and received my bowl and my robe, and some of them prepared a seat, and they addressed me by name and with the word friend. And when they had spoken thus, I said this. I said, monks, do not address the Tathagata by name or with the word friend. Right? So he says, so the interesting thing, in relationship to that last guy, he says, I. But then these guys say, we know you. You're our friend. You're that guy, Siddhartha. And he said, no, don't identify me with that person you used to know. And he says he's the Tathagata. People debate about exactly what that means, but more or less it means that guy's gone. That's done. And so he's woken up to something else. And so the thing I want to emphasize there is this sort of ambiguous or ambivalent sense in which he's the same guy, right? He's the guy who did this, for sure. He had to go through that process. But he underwent a change. And that thing in him that is this awakening, that to which he has awakened, can't be identified with the who he used to be, right? So to look at that now a little more carefully, I want to go back to section 8 when he first talked about what those realizations were that he had. He says, for a generation caught up in worldly attachment, this doctrine is hard to see. And then he says, but here's what the thing is that they need to see. He says, dependent arising, the tranquilizing of all dispositions to action, the renunciation of all attachments, and then the destruction of craving, dispassion, cessation, and nibbana. So that's what I want to talk about now, starting with that notion of dependent arising. I want you just to start by thinking about some pretty familiar examples of desire, I think. Sometimes you can see something. Maybe it's a dessert. Maybe it's French fries. I don't know. But something looks so good to you that once you see it, you think, oh, I really want to have that. I got to have that. Right? It seems to me we often have that experience with food that it looks so appealing to us that we find it hard to resist. But an interesting thing happens. Sometimes, like, forget about dessert and French fries. Like, just imagine you're hungry and you see a plate of food. You think, oh, that's so great. It looks so good, right? Um, and so you're drawn to it and you eat it. It's interesting that after you've eaten your lunch or whatever, looking at that same food, it doesn't have that same kind of attractive power over you, right? When you were hungry and you were, I don't know, you still had to keep doing your work, you had to talk to your friend, and the food in the cafeteria or whatever was just sitting there like, oh, it just seemed irresistible. But then after you've eaten, you don't notice it. In some cases, you might even think, oh, that's kind of gross. I don't want it around me. So the thing I want you to notice is that the very way that appears to you changes. It looked desirable. It looked irresistible. Now it does not. I mean, you might have that experience in other contexts too. Maybe in context of sex, like in a certain context or certain situation, like you really desire this other person and this other person's touch, and it just seems, again, irresistible. But maybe I don't know, after you have an orgasm or something like that, that person doesn't seem so interesting to you, doesn't seem so compelling. I mean, I think probably some people have pretty nasty experiences of that when they find that someone was looking upon them desiringly and enthusiastically, and suddenly that person turns to them in a kind of a negative way, and they think, what's wrong? A minute ago you thought I was great, and now you're repelling me. But so I want you just to think about those kinds of situations and how the the thing that seems desirable can change its appearance. Let's take it actually to one more example. And so you remember he said back in section 2, people who are liable to birth and death often seek their satisfaction in other things that are like that. And he referred to those people as enslaved, infatuated, and addicted. So I want to think about that issue of being addicted for a minute. Take smoking. Again, when you're, same sort of point I made about the food in the cafeteria. When you're sitting there and there's a package of cigarettes there and you're a smoker, sometimes those cigarettes can seem like a magnet, can seem like they are just calling out to you, smoke me, right? They seem so good and so necessary. And they seem like a kind of force drawing you, attracting you, summoning you. And you would say they are irresistible. The thing I want you to notice about that smoking thing specifically is that it's hard to break the habit of smoking, right? But if you do, one of the things you come to realize is that it's not that the cigarettes as little material entities in the world were somehow magically attracting you. It's that you were addicted, right? And so they appeared to you as overpoweringly desirable. But their ability to appear that way to you came from the fact that you were hooked on them, right? It was the state you were in that made them able to have this effect on you, right? It was your addictive desire, your craving, that made them seem to have this force over you. So the thing about addiction that's really interesting, that phenomenon of smoking and so on, is there you can see that your desire for the object and the object's ability to command your desire arise together. Right? When you think about the food or the sexually desirable person or the cigarette, the way you immediately experience it is that it is like a kind of magnetic force acting on you. So you portray yourself in those situations as kind of passively undergoing something that's happening to you. But when you think about the situation of being addicted to smoking, you can see it's not like that. It's that there are two things that are arising as a pair. There's a kind of desire that you're cultivating that lets that thing have that compelling force upon you. And the way you change it is not by changing the nature of cigarettes. The way you change that situation is by changing your craving, right? The way you stop being a smoker isn't by making cigarettes magically different so that they're not attractive. The way you change it is by getting out of your habitual dependency upon them, right? You have to change yourself in order to change the effect those things have on you. So that's the notion I want you to think about when you see him refer to dependent arising. I want you to see that notion that the attractiveness of the thing can't be separated from the attitude of desiring it that you bring. So it's not that that thing causes your desire. In fact, if anything, it's your desire that causes that thing to look attractive, right? So whereas we portray ourselves as sort of passively subject to the desirability of things that draw us this way and that, the truth is almost the opposite, that it is the desires we bring that let things have an effect on us. We allow ourselves to be essentially enslaved by those objects. I said smoking. Let's think about another one too. I used the example of sex before, but let's take that up again in a slightly different way. We have views that certain men or women are attractive, and they elicit from us our desire in that similar sort of way that we experience this thing as having a kind of magnetic force upon us. But the thing you can see if you look into it, and you can study this with John Berger, for example, in Ways of Seeing, is the way that our very desires have been shaped by advertising and all kinds of other things. So we've sort of been taught to look for certain sorts of things which we're going to find desirable. We have had cultivated in us a kind of craving for certain things that then makes those things seem compelling to us. So again, in other words, it's not that the way people look automatically, magically force feelings upon us or automatically, magically draw behavior out of us. It's that the way we have cultivated our own desires and expectations has put the power into those things so that they have this effect on us. So we have effectively made ourselves sort of trappable by that thing. And again, whereas we portray ourselves as passive, it's actually what we're doing that lets this thing happen. I'd like to take that one step farther too, and just think about that. I use smoking, I use sexualized advertising as a way of constructing, gender models and so on. I want to take it one step farther and think just in general about our whole social situation and its values, right? We grow up being led into deep views about what success is going to have to be. You have to look a certain way, you have to have a spouse that looks a certain way, you have to have a certain kind of job, you have to have a certain kind of house, whatever it is. We have built into us, into our very way of relating to the world, this demand that we put upon the world that it's going to speak to us in certain terms. Right? We crave certain kinds of things and look to them to fulfill us, right? But it's not because those things are inherently desirable. It's because we've had built up in us by our cultural upbringing and whatever else a kind of addiction to the idea that that's where happiness is going to be found. Well, he says the thing that came after that was the tranquilizing of all dispositions to action. So I think the point there is grasping this thing about dependent arising isn't just a theoretical point about how things in the world work. It's noticing something about yourself. It's noticing about yourself, like as a cigarette addict or something like that. It's noticing that for you, things that look this one way really should be understood as this pair of how you're projecting the demands that are making this thing have a certain effect on you. So understanding dependent arising allows you to understand something about your psychological motivations. It allows you to understand how you are living on the basis of certain cravings. You think of yourself as just a person dealing with the world, and the world is making you happy or not. The world is giving you opportunities or not. Like, you tend to think about your ability to be happy and succeed in the world in terms of what your situation, the outside stuff, presents you with. And what the Buddha is emphasizing, on the contrary, is that you need to look inside. You need to see that the the whole way you've set up the terms of things is what's determining how you are and aren't able to be happy. And you've basically, if you're a normal average person, you've basically set things up so that you've defined the world in terms of some profound cravings that are always going to leave you struggling, unsatisfied, frustrated. Like, you've defined yourself and your relationship to the world in such a way that life is kind of a ongoing, frustrating struggle. And so, understanding that structure of dependent arising as it plays out in your life is allowing you to recognize about yourself that you have built your identity out of craving. And so that's what you want to separate yourself from now. You want to break those addictions. And so I like this language here of tranquilizing all dispositions to action. In this sense, usually what we think of as acting is responding to those prompts that our environment is giving us that are themselves rooted in our cravings, right? So you think of acting as, lighting a cigarette or whatever. What that shows you is that the whole way your relationship to acting is built is based around this deep notion that I want. This deep ways you're sort of committed to, like, thinking, I gotta have that, I gotta have that, I gotta have that, ways that have been socially introduced into you and whatever else. And so the very form action takes in your everyday life is, like the cigarette, is this constant feeding of your addiction, this constant responding to wants, not even necessarily at the level of you explicitly formulating a set of desires. I want this, but more like just the basic way you relate to things is out of this. Everything has to answer to this profound need I have to have the world turn out to be a certain way, and so on. It's kind of like a deep wanting that almost lies behind your explicit self-awareness. So that's what we're trying to shut down. And so tranquilizing all dispositions to action is, I think, like that. It's like recognizing, oh, I'm motivated to act this way for these reasons, so I'm not going to let that define me. That's what I'm going to try to resist. And he says that goes along then with the renunciation of attachment, right? It's realizing, like, these things are all, part of the same thing, right? It's realizing that I have already sort of in the depths of my soul defined myself as addicted to this thing, as attached to this thing. And I'm trying to separate myself from those things. And that leads, then he says, to the destruction of craving and dispassion. And I just want to pull all that together again in that notion of dispassion and the notion of the tranquilization of all dispositions to action. I want to bring those together and think a little bit about what acting then is actually like. Right? There's the Buddha himself, is still going to do lots of things, but he's not going to act out of that web of cravings. And so it's not that that person who he was, who is now acting to try to fulfill certain things. And so going back to that vision he had, or not vision, but that experience he had when he was 9 that he remembered in the deer park. One of the things about his, little experience as a 9-year-old was that he was noticing these things in a way dispassionately. Like he wasn't relating to the man plowing the field or anything out of his own desires. He was just sort of contemplating it. And also, in that contemplation, he was experiencing a kind of spontaneous compassion for all of those things around him in the world. And so that attitude is the one that real action should come from. It shouldn't come out of craving. It shouldn't come out of addiction, the sickness of needing a sort of built-in disease you have being fed. It should come out of that sort of dispassionate responsiveness to the needs of the situation as they are revealed to a compassionate being. There's a particular line from the Bhagavad Gita, which is, another Indian text or an oral tradition, actually, from roughly the same time, that also is about action that I think is kind of relevant here. It's the story of a great battle, and Krishna, sort of godlike figure, is giving advice to this guy Arjuna, and Arjuna is called upon to basically start a war, and he doesn't want to do it because he's going to have to kill a bunch of people and so on. And Krishna says to him, you are only entitled to action, never to its fruits. Do not let the fruits of action be your motive, but do not attach yourself also to inaction. And I kind of like that idea there. I think that's just a nice way to say it, that Arjuna is called to act in a certain way just because the situation demands that action. And, Krishna is particularly saying, don't commit yourself to non-action. Don't just withdraw from the demands of things. A little bit like Brahma said to the Buddha, like, don't go hide away. You got to go teach. But what Krishna says is when you're acting, it's not about thinking about what you're going to get from it. It's not about thinking of the fruits as if they're yours. That the action isn't even really yours. The action is just what you're called upon to do in the situation, and that's what you should do. So I think that the thing the Buddha is saying here is actually pretty similar. So you go through this series of things: the dependent arising, the recognition of dependent arising, the tranquilization of all dispositions to action, the renunciation of attachment, the destruction of craving, dispassion. It seems like that's the path from this basic recognition to the point where you can operate from something like that kind of experience 9-year-old Siddhartha was having. And that's the thing then that he wants to teach the other monks. That's I think the basic lesson, the core lesson that the Buddha is offering. That's what it is to wake up to things. That's what I'm hoping you'll take away as the basic sort of lesson of the Buddha that he's presenting you with here. There's a lot more that comes up in here at the end. And after he talks to those monks, he says, well, here I was entering the first jhana. It's the same word that translated a few times over becomes the word Zen. It's a word that becomes a kind of technical word in the later tradition of Buddhism as they sort of analyze all the different sorts of dimensions of experience that you can have as you engage in this process of kind of self-observation, where instead of just being drawn along by your experience, you notice what's going on in your experience and you try to understand how the way the world looks to you in terms of its desirability is paired with things you're bringing, right? And you use that sort of insight into yourself as a way of dismantling the snares that have trapped you in ultimately frustrating and unfulfilling ways of life. So those later technicalities I don't want to go into, because that's there, that seems very clearly part of this that reflects a kind of system that has been developed, let's say in the few hundred years since the Buddha died, system for understanding all these things and for teaching, whatever, meditational practice or something like that. I mean, those things are all fine. Those things are surely all valuable. It's just that later development of the sort of system of Buddhism is not what I'm after. I'm really just after trying to get what I take to be the core point the Buddha is trying to teach you and trying to get you to see for yourself. And as far as I know, everything I've said here is something that you can recognize for yourself. You don't need a teacher. You don't need special doctrines. You don't need magical beings. You don't need anything. You just need to reflect on your own experience. And that, I think, is the founding insight of all Buddhism. And that basic point that we've got here, it seems to me, is a kind of profound point for mental health, for helping you to develop as a person who is in sort of good psychological state. It's very valuable for compassion, for this idea of how you're going to relate to the world as a good person, how you're going to do things that are good. And it also has to do with grasping what's true. It's separating yourself from the kinds of ways that you're so caught up in things that you can't see clearly. You're only seeing things out of certain cravings, and it's teaching you both to learn how to understand yourself and your experience, and in so doing develop what you might call a sort of more objective view on things, more better grasp of the way things really are. So you're, in that sense, you're waking up from a kind of delusion to truth about yourself and truth about the world. And so I think that's the profound and important insight.